So we've been talking about relationships, and we've been talking about the process of the relationship, which is depicted by the words Lecha, Dodi, Likrat Kala, Pnei Shabbat Nikabla, that the male needs to go to greet the female, so to speak, and through that he elicits her to come into his space, and Pnei Shabbat Nikabla, the two of them are able to, he is able to receive her innerness, Pnei Shabbat, and then Nikabla, both of them are on a mutual space together. Rachel, can you unplug the bench maker? Sorry. And the previous Rebbe's Maimer had described two analogies. The first analogy that had been used was one of a teacher who wants to speak to his students. So the first thing he does is begins the class with a joke or a riddle. And through that, he's able to establish the relationship and the rapport. And as a result of that, everybody's able to come to a place where they're recipients, they're willing to learn and they're interested in learning. And the second analogy that had been used is a father that wants to play with the child. He has to bend down and lift the child up. So in this mimer, the Rebbe is going to analyze both of those analogies. The first question that's asked is, why do we need both? And then there's the surface level of the analogy, which we already understand, which is the idea that the giver, the teacher, the father, needs to relate to the recipient, which is the student or the child or whatever it is. And then there's a deeper element that the Rebbe wants to pull out, which is actually, of course, the reason why both analogies are given. And that's exactly where we're going right now. So I apologize. Usually we wanted to kind of explore it together a little bit, but because of the fact that we're running quite far behind, and there's a lot to unfold, I'd like to go back directly into the mimer. So chapter 2. Chapter 1, if you recall, had really spoken about the fact that this concept is not just applicable within the physical bride and groom and how it's enacted at the wedding ceremony, but we said it's drawn throughout all the levels, from the highest of spiritual levels down to the world of intimacy. All of them have the same kind of process in which the male has a responsibility to be able to meet the female aspect and to be able to bring the female aspect into a certain space. And as a result of that, to be able to create a new space, which is the space of unity of both of them, which brings both of them to a completely different level. So the first analogy that we had used, the first parable was, as in chapter 2, the first parable that the Rebbe brought for the concept was that of the transmission of information from a teacher to a student. To illustrate this, he retold the Talmudic anecdote how Rabbi used to tell his students a joke or riddle prior to teaching them. The students would laugh and afterwards sit with awe as they listened to the lecture. That was the analogy. And we explained how this entire process begins with an external facet of the relationship. Then afterwards, it elicits an internal element that's a result of the giver going down to the receiver. So this joke is just an external facet of information, but it is the mechanism through which Rabba was able to open the hearts and minds of his students to the inner purpose of his lecture, the actual information that he taught. So the joke, of course, is completely a a side factor. And even though we explained in the mimer that the truth of the matter is that even though a joke from a scholar is not just a joke, it's something of deep relevance, and it needs to be studied as well, because there are inferences there that are not just for the purpose of cracking jokes. But still, the fact of the matter is that his class is not about the joke. The class is the information that he wants to teach. And the joke is only that mechanism through which he's getting the students into a space.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Shoot.
I understand the whole idea with the joke, but if the joke is so good, why is it sort of the exception rather than the norm? Why do we say that Rava did this? How come almost everybody didn't do this? Why is he the exception that we mentioned? Why didn't this become the norm of teaching, to start off with humorous idea and soften up the students and then teach the concept?
I don't know. I think that it's definitely a when talking about the best practices, I think it's certainly there, and people recognize it. Go ahead, Mr. Resnick.
I wanted to say maybe he was a good joke teller.
Maybe. There's certainly other people who don't know how to tell jokes. That's definitely true.
Not everybody is good at it.
It's a good question. But the Gemara is definitely telling us in such a way that it's understood that this is an important way to be able to create.
As a matter of fact, I know a rabbi that tried it and didn't work for him too well. No, really, I'm serious.
Right. Yeah, it really depends, and like I said, the time that you have, and there are different aspects of it, but the fact of the matter is that it is an important element. You do need to make a connection. You can't just be teaching from the top, and that's without question, that's the idea here. So the question remains: why don't we do that? Now you're challenging me to give over a joke, so I'll have to. So I was in the mental asylum the other day as a visitor, not as a patient. And one of the patients says to me, despite what the doctors tell me, I really am the Messiah. So I said, who told you that? He says, well, God did. And I hear from the next room, I did not. No guarantees for a joke every single day, but we'll go with that. All right. So again, we might think to ourselves that basically it's just external. It's really, really pointless, but it's not. And that's exactly what the Rebbe wants to point out, is that the not just the purpose of the analogy, but the actual description of a joke is itself, what a joke elicits is itself part of the analogy. And that's part of the parable. Now, in certain Maimarim, this is a side point, in certain Maimarim, the Rebbe would mention each one of his predecessors. And it was understood that was bringing them into the conversation or inviting them into the presence of what was going on. And in this Maimer, the Rebbe does this as well. In my translation, sort of adaptation of this Maimer, I didn't quote every single one of them because some of them are the nuances that are brought are slight, and I wanted to focus on the main idea as opposed to go through every single point. But parenthetically, the Rebbe quotes the second Rebbe of Chabad, and he says this parable was originally taught by the Mittler Rebbe, but not in conjunction with the statement of Lecha Dodi. That connection was made by the Rebbe Rashab. And again, the reason why this parenthetical comment is made is in order to be able to bring both of these people into the conversation, the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab. In any case, the Mittler Rebbe explains that the source of laughter comes from what can be described as undiluted pleasure. It transcends any level or specific parameter of enjoyment. And to explain this, there are different types of pleasure. Of course, you have the simplest pleasure, which is pleasure of taste. And it's very simple because, of course, it only involves the mouth itself, and it goes in and it's, forget about it. It's over. Then there are deeper pleasures. There are pleasures such as the pleasure of music. There are levels of music, or there are experiences in music that are not just about the ears, but they can be very much an entire experience where all your entire self becomes completely absorbed in the experience. So it's not just about the specific song or the specific intonations, so to speak. It becomes a massive experience. And so in terms of that, that's a higher experience. There are experiences of art that when you see something, it moves you, and and those are all different types of pleasures. But oftentimes, even though if you look at each level of pleasure as it is, it still involves with a particular faculty. So the pleasure of sports, is obviously the involvement of the body in a particular type of athletic movement. Of course, intellectual debate is the mind. Music, as we said, mainly focuses on the ears, although it can be something that's beyond that. And art can be mostly focused on the eyes. But laughter is actually something that's beyond. It's not specific. It's very, very, very not specific. There are elements of laughter that really come from something that can't specifically be explained. If you have to explain a joke, it's not much of a joke. It doesn't really have the humor. It doesn't bring you to that spontaneous level of enjoyment. And of course, retelling something oftentimes doesn't have the same element of joy that the first time you had it was. So the pleasure that comes from laughter is something that is undiluted pleasure. It is something that is not specific to any particular something. And as soon as you try to define it, you lose that pleasure. And based on this, we can understand that it transcends even the pleasure of understanding. Because that pleasure is particular and focused on the mind rather than the transcendent and the all-encompassing. So when you look at it in its source, the joke is eliciting a higher experience than the actual class. The class is focusing on the intellectual information, and of course that brings us to a certain, a level of pleasure, the pleasure of understanding, the pleasure of appreciation, the material or whatever it is. But laughter brings the teachers and students a level of pleasure that is beyond just the pleasure of the mind. And then the Rebbe actually says, go ahead. Question? You're muted. Kira, you're muted.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I'm a public speaker, and to different Jewish audiences, And I never used to tell a joke up front because the subject was a degree of humor in it. And I was asked to speak to a yeshiva-based Black Hat community. I never had done that before. They were just, and I was very nervous because how do I communicate to these people, because my message was very spiritual content. So I cracked a joke, and all of the audience I saw them relax in front of me, you know. And what that did was showed I was human. I was a human being, you know. Wasn't somebody, you know, the list of references or whatever. It was somebody who can relate to them on a very basic level, which is the joke wasn't just a joke. It was an experience I had when I was giving my talk in Israel. So I'm actually think it's a very good idea, because it really opens up people, and you're then talking to them on a human basis.
Absolutely. And what we're saying here is that there's that connection that's created, but the fact of the matter is that, interestingly enough, the source of experience that the joke comes from, that the pleasure that the joke elicits comes from, is actually higher than the source of pleasure that the class or the subject matter comes from. And so that's a very, very, very powerful idea. And the Rebbe actually breaks this down and says, actually, let's take this down one further step. He says, in actuality, there are two levels of undiluted pleasure. There is such pleasure that is felt, or in the Hebrew, he uses the term tanug murgash, and such pleasure that is beyond feeling. And that is this higher level, a state of inner being, of transcendence, that is achieved through the students absorbing the information internally, both by the students and even the teacher. And in fact, the Talmud notes that the teacher receives the most from his students. So we're saying here something very, very powerful. We're saying that the relationship that is created through the joke, through the mechanism of the joke, is such that it elicits a greater ability of the students to be able to learn and to experience the subject matter beyond just the actual class in and of itself. So the joke has become a springboard so that the students are able to receive on a higher level, but it's not just the students, it's even the teacher themselves. When the teacher gives the joke, the teacher himself is lifted up to a higher level as well. And that's the reason why we say that the teacher says, that I've been able to learn from my students more than everybody else. As a result of the relationship, the teacher gets lifted up. As long as the teacher stays in their own space and is using just a downward mechanism, a downward flow of information, then they remain who they are. But by creating this relationship, both of them are lifted up to a different level. So like we spoke about before, there's relevance of this idea very much into the intimate world. And that is that one of the greatest problems of today's intimate world is the idea that maximization of pleasure, maximization of experience. And there's all sorts of course, worlds that explore that. And for God knows, it's probably $1 billion market. But what the Torah is teaching us is that for one to focus on a felt pleasure, a specific pleasure even within intimacy, is to be missing the point. The experience is meant for a much deeper pleasure, a pleasure that is beyond feeling, a pleasure that is one of experience, of inner being, of togetherness that is completely beyond the specifics. And as much as a person starts focusing on and getting stuck in the world of specifics, they're missing the point. And they're tilting after windmills. The idea that intimacy is meant to be this two-part dance, so to speak, to bring the two of you to a different experience, an experience of tainu bilti murgash, a pleasure that is beyond feeling, a state of being, is a crucial element. It's a crucial element to a marriage. It's a crucial element to intimacy. It's a crucial element to human psychology. And it's something that people oftentimes forget. And because the fact of the matter is that the easiest thing is, of course, to focus in on what's felt. And to say, okay, the problem is there. And point out to this particular thing as the problem. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that the two people are not necessarily recognizing that their job is to be able to go to a space together for something that is beyond this particular space. So this idea that there is a pleasure that is not specific, there's a transcendent pleasure, which is the pleasure of a state of being as opposed to a specific pleasure, is an absolutely crucial element of relationships, an absolutely crucial element of intimacy. Chapter 3 brings us to the next level. The second parable brought to explain this idea was that of a father who would like to play with his child face to face. And in order to do so, he must lower himself, pick the child up, and bring the child close. The raising of the child is only done for the purpose of playing with the child, and it is therefore the external aspect of the process. And the playing with the child is the internal element of transmission. So again, the external, picking the child up, the internal, the relationship that is created as a result of playing with the child. So this parable comes from the Maggid of Message. And in this original source, the Maggid adds that the child plays with his father's beard. Now, playing with the father's beard is actually an idea in spiritual world that is more than just a figurative concept, as we're going to explain. There's a story of a guy who was asking the Rebbe for blessings to have children. And the Rebbe told him 2 or 3 years in a row that maybe it would be a good idea to grow your beard. And the guy didn't grow his beard, and he asked for bracha again, and the Rebbe made the comment again, maybe you should grow your beard. And then the third year, finally, the guy said to the Rebbe, kind of in frustration, what does my beard have anything to do with it? And the Rebbe response is the child has to have what to play with. So that was, of course, a humorous remark, but that was not, the purpose was not the humorous remark, it was for a deeper idea. And that the beard represents, as we're going to see, the 13 attributes of mercy. And there are many different ways of looking for it. The Rebbe was giving him a mitzvah to access the blessing and all that. But in general, the idea of the beard is not just the mitzvah of having a beard, it also represents a little bit more, as we're going to see. The Maggid is thereby hinting to the spiritual element of the beard, which is the 13 attributes of mercy, which transcend Hishtalshelus. So the 13 attributes of mercy are what we say during Tafkan. We mention it many times, of course, over the course of Yom Kippur.
Rabbi, You should translate Hishtalshalos.
Yeah, just a moment. Hashem kil racham v'chana nerech apayim v'rab chesed emes noitzer chesed alofim noisoven v'pesha v'chata v'nakei. So that sentence comes from the conversation between Moshe and the Jewish people. Moshe and God. God tells Moshe that the Jewish people have sinned through the creating of the golden calf, but by repeating my 13 attributes of mercy, you will be able to elicit that mercy and be able to get forgiveness for them. And on several occasions, Moshe needs to mention these 13 attributes. What exactly are we talking about? In the system of the relationship, the basic system has a tit for tat mechanism. That we put a certain amount in, God puts a certain amount out. We do something inappropriate and it disconnects us from God to some degree. And that's the way things work. In any relationship, that's the way things work. But then there's a place of transcendence. And that's what we're referring to when we say Hishtalshalos here. There's a space in which God creates an override system for us to be able to reach into the relationship that is beyond just the tit for tat. That's a place of mercy in which Hashem realizes who we are and that we screw up and that, we have human foibles and all that. And he allows us access to forgiveness. Forgiveness overrides the entire system, completely jumpstarts the relationship, and completely does away with any of the negativity of the past. So when we say that it transcends Hishtalshalos, what we're talking about is that in general, the relationship works in a very systematic fashion. But when we reach into God's mercy, we are transcending that system and we are reaching into God's inner being, so to speak. And that's how we get forgiveness. What the Rebbe says is here, while these attributes of mercy are indeed beyond the parameters of our world, they nevertheless have a relativity to the world. In fact, the word midot itself conjures the concept of medida, which means limitation and measurement. Likewise, hair, in terms of beard and all that kind of thing, in the Kabbalistic framework denotes just a ray or an extension of the essence, as opposed to an actual being and part of the essence. So what does this represent? This then represents the element of makif that is being drawn down through an external movement. But once again, through the meeting of the Father and Son in the same space as with the male and female, an even higher essence is drawn down. So there's a recognition that through this process, it's not just an element of the two of them meeting face to face, but they are able to elicit something that is beyond the two of them. They're able to create a relationship that is such that it supersedes the system of father and son, and it brings the father and son into a different place together. And there's a new space that is being created. So now we understand the purpose of the two analogies. The first analogy, the purpose was to remind us, the idea of the joke was to draw out this idea of the undiluted pleasure, the non-specific pleasure, the non-felt pleasure. To recognize that Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Pnei Shabbat Nekabla, that through the husband or through the giver in the case, creating this relationship, and focusing not on the specifics, but creating the space of the relationship, they are able to transcend that specific instance and to be able to come to a higher level and to be able to reach a higher level as a result and not get distracted on the specifics. And the second analogy is to tell you that it transcends not just the relationship itself, but it goes deeper into the essence and actually is able to draw down an essential state of being that is represented by the 13 attributes of mercy, even higher than the system of tit for tat. And the next mimer, the next chapter, the Rebbe is going to bring that down practically once again to be able to apply this to our service of Hashem. But certainly with regards to ourselves and with regards to our relationships, there's no question that these ideas are very, 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 very applicable. We oftentimes, in relationships, we oftentimes get stuck in the moment. And what the Rebbe is teaching us here is that we really need to allow the interaction to transcend the moment. We need to allow the interactions to lift both of us to a different place. So it's not about what I want out of this particular transaction. It's about how the two of us in this relationship can find transcendence. And the way to do that is to be able to recognize our place in that entire process. As the giver, I need to recognize who the receiver is and how the receiver needs to be able to receive. And as a receiver, I need to recognize myself as a receiver and be willing to be able to receive. And be willing to give back as a result, and not just give back tit for tat, but this infinite element of tit for tat. This infinite level of the relationship where it's about transcendence. This is something that's really, really important in every single one of our areas of relationship. You know, whether we're talking about husband and wife, whether we're talking about parenthood, whether we're talking about even other friendships, we have to remind ourselves of this in order for the relationship to attain this level of transcendence. And Lecha Dodi Likrat Kalaf, there needs to be a greeting, and there needs to be an external, a very, very seems surface level elements of the relationship in order to be able to elicit the more internal element of the relationship. But even the internal relationship is not just for that particular transaction, it is for something much, much greater than it. And that it happens as a result of the two coming into a new space of unity, and that in which transcendence can be attained. So that is, again, I apologize, I just wanted to catch up a little bit for today. But that's a little bit for today. Any quick questions before we go over to Rabbi Smith?